Welcome back. This is our last mini lecture on classical conditioning, and in this lecture I'm going to review some core concepts in the field of classical conditioning and tell you how advertisers use classical conditioning to get us to think that eating a particular breakfast cereal will earn us friends, and driving a particular car or wearing a particular perfume will mean that people will throw themselves at us sexually. All right, the first concept I want to talk about is acquisition. What gets acquired during classical conditioning? Well, it's the learning of the association, right? It's learning that the neutral stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus, so that a bell predicts food, right? Or a fuzzy animal predicts something scary. In classical conditioning, so if you want to train your dog, classical conditioning is the way to go. It's important that the neutral stimulus appear before the unconditioned stimulus, and ideally about half a second before. If I give you, so for example, in the little Alpert study, if John Watson had put a fuzzy animal in front of baby Alpert and then waited 15 minutes to make a scary sound, the baby never would have learned the association between fuzzy thing and scary sound. So they need to be, in order to learn the association, they need to be close to each other, and you need to learn that the neutral stimulus predicts the unconditioned response, so the neutral stimulus has to come first. So clicker, then treat. Clicker, then treat. Another concept in classical conditioning is something called stimulus generalization. Maybe when you were a kid, you were taken to a circus and there was a scary clown that scared you. Stimulus generalization occurs when the fear reaction that you had to that first scary clown generalizes to every clown you ever see again, right? So if as an adult you find yourself kind of getting sweaty and nervous around Ronald McDonald, that's stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization occurs all the time. Sometimes it's really funny. Sometimes it isn't. For example, if you adopted a dog from a kennel and maybe each time you raise your hand, the dog goes crazy or cries, that's classical conditioning. So the dog has learned from its previous owner, unfortunately, that a raised hand means that pain is coming. You are a different person. You raise your hand. The dog is generalizing to you. So you need to extinguish that association. We'll talk about that briefly. Stick with dogs. Let's say that as a child you were scared by a big dog. And then as an adult, every time you see a dog, you have that reaction, right? You're scared, your breathing changes, you start sweating. That's stimulus generalization. It's not that dog who bit you, but that dog looks close enough to the dog who did bite you that you generalize your fear. Maybe you're flying on a plane and the plane has terrible, terrible turbulence and you think, oh my God, I'm going to die. So that particular flight was bad and you had a very big fear response in that flight, stimulus generalization would occur if you were afraid to get on any other flights, or maybe if you were afraid of heights in general. That would be generalization. Now, there's also the opposite, which is stimulus discrimination, which is the opposite of generalization. So instead of generalization is opening things up, discrimination is getting down to a particular case. So, for example, maybe you were walking down the street and a pit bull, a particular breed of dog called a pit bull, scared you. Later, if you walk down the street and there's a poodle or a beagle or something, you're not afraid, then you can say that stimulus discrimination has occurred. You have learned to discriminate between the dog that scared you and other dogs that don't scare you. Stimulus discrimination is something that your pets need to learn too. So maybe at the beginning your pet thinks every time that a can appears that dinner is on the way, right? So the dog has learned the pairing that can means dinner's coming. But eventually the dog learns to discriminate. It's like, well, if you pull out a can of soup for dinner, eventually the dog will learn, oh no, it's only yellow cans or certain cans from a particular closet, not this closet. So that's a kind of stimulus discrimination. Extinction is when, after you've learned a pairing, you break that pairing. You learn to disassociate the two stimuli. So, for example, maybe I get on a plane, it's terribly turbulent, and I develop a fear of flights. But let's say I have to take more flights anyway. So I keep getting on the plane, even though it makes me really scared, and I keep taking flights, and flight after flight, nothing scary happens. Eventually, my fear of flying decreases, it extinguishes. Maybe you've heard the phrase, get back on the horse. The thing that scared you, you have to unlearn that fear by having similar experiences that don't end in fear. That's extinction. There's this really frustrating thing that happens with fear. Actually, it happens with all kinds of conditioning. So you learn an association, and then maybe you unlearn it, and you're going along your life and everything's fine, and then all of a sudden one day the fear is back. That's called spontaneous recovery. It's very common in classical conditioning, and what you have to do is just extinguish it again. And it may appear later, and you just have to keep extinguishing it. So classical conditioning, once you've been classically conditioned to be fearful of something, it's a long-term strategy to really cleanse your system from learning that pairing. Classical conditioning is used a lot in therapies, in behavioral psychology. It can be used in aversion therapy. It can also be used to desensitize people from their phobias. So let's say that you have a habit that you dislike. Maybe, let's say, smoking or speeding in your car. What do? You need to learn to associate smoking with an immediate negative consequence. So I have some rubber bands in the picture there. And what happens? Every time, not that you smoke, every time you feel like you want a cigarette, you have a rubber band around your wrist. Every time you feel like you want a cigarette, you snap that rubber band. So the craving for a cigarette is associated with pain, right? And if you do that enough times, eventually you'll stop feeling the craving for the cigarette because it's associated with pain. It's no longer a pleasurable thing. So actually, a number of, especially before the patches that are available now for getting people off of their nicotine addiction with cigarettes, that was the way people did it. There's also systematic desensitization. So some people with fears, it limits them. They really want to get rid of the fear. And therapists use behaviorism to help them get rid of the fear. So for example, let's say that you are afraid of spiders. What a therapist would do is have you come into their office and maybe start off with a picture of a spider on the other side of the room, and the therapist would work with you until you could be really comfortable and calm in the presence of a picture of a spider. And maybe in the next week, the spider moves a little closer, and again, the therapist works on helping you to have a calm response, and it gets closer and closer. And then eventually maybe it's a real spider in a box on the other side of the room, and you go through the whole thing again. So you just desensitize, you decouple the fear from the visual perception of the spider. Now it turns out, we know from Dr. John Garcia that not all pairings are equally easy to learn. It turns out that evolution has shaped our fears, and as a result, it's really easy to learn fears of some things and very difficult to learn fears of other things. So for example, it's very easy for humans to learn to be afraid of snakes and spiders and to develop a fear of heights. Anything that would have killed our Neanderthal ancestors 100,000 years ago, it's easy for us to learn to be afraid of those things today. On the other hand, You can use classical conditioning all you want to try to teach somebody to be afraid of a flower or afraid of a snail, and it turns out to be much harder. So we have biological predispositions. Garcia showed us that its evolution does really shape what we're afraid of in a way that's consistent with what our ancestors should have been afraid of. Think classical conditioning is boring? Advertisers don't. You are subjected to advertising every day that's associated with classical conditioning. What do you do if you are an ad man, or literally a madman, which is, do you remember the TV show Mad Men? John B. Watson, the guy who made Little Alpert scared, he was the original madman. He applied classical conditioning to advertising, and advertising has involved classical conditioning ever since. What do you do if you're an advertising person and you need to increase the sales of a particular product? Maybe it's a boring product. Maybe it's a dangerous product, like cigarettes. What do? You associate your product with an unconditioned stimulus. Now, what do we respond to unconditionally? By that I mean, what do we respond to in a way that no one had to teach us? Well, sex, friendship, power, prestige, all of those things we respond to sort of naturally. So if you're an ad person, what do? You build an association with your boring neutral stimulus and that sexy feeling. So lots and lots of products are sold in a way that tries to build associations between the product and sexual attractiveness, right? So you might have a boring little car, but if you get that car, look at all the sexy people who will flock to your side. Or, I see these ads all the time, they break my heart. Little kids ads. If you watch ads designed for children, they'll break your heart because they'll teach the child that a particular cereal or a particular drink will be associated with love of parents, lots of friends to play with, all of these positive things. Ronald McDonald, right? Come to McDonald's, eat a Big Mac, and gain all sorts of friends. So classical conditioning, you live with it every day, you might as well know how it works. All right, guys. Thanks.